Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Be a Better You podcast. I am your host and subconscious reprogramming coach, Allison K. Dagny. Now, today we're going to be talking about managing and removing triggers. I put a story on Instagram the other day and asked for feedback, and this was the number one thing that people wanted to know of the options that I presented. Now, a couple of things is that managing triggers is 100% possible. And that's in the same vein as coping. Removing triggers, we can absolutely remove some triggers, 100%. Some we will not be able to remove completely, but we can lessen them. And so what I want to talk about with you today is how we can do this and helping you to be able to manage and remove or lessen your own triggers that you might be experiencing. So we're going to talk about what triggers are, where they come from. I'm going to share a personal story with you about my own triggers that I was able to eliminate. And then we are going to talk about how challenging it can be to try to do this by yourself and why they can't always be avoided. So I'm going to help you as best as I can to deal with whatever triggers that you're experiencing from your trauma, from your abuse, and give you some ideas on how you can better manage and lessen your own triggers. Now, before we get into this, I just wanted to remind everyone that I have an online community called the Radiate and Rise Together community, and this community is for survivors and thrivers after emotional and narcissistic abuse. So if you have a need for support and community, I would love to see you in this community with me and all the other members. We have weekly content that comes out, and the goal of the content is to really help you with tools that you can use and put into practice for your own healing. You can come into the group anytime you want. You can check out any of the different lessons and challenges that we're doing in there and pick and choose what works for you. I also, which is really exciting, have recently decided to add one extra coaching call per month. So as it stood before, we were doing the last Friday of every month. We would have an hour-long coaching call. But recently, because I have the capacity, I've decided to add one extra coaching call inside that group. So you're getting 2 full hours of coaching per month inside this community if you join. It's $33 a month and you can cancel anytime. So if you need that support and you want a safe healing space that's not on Facebook or not in any sort of public forum, you can join us anytime with the link in the show notes. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the first part of this, which is understanding our triggers. Now, I really want to explain what triggers are in the context of emotional and psychological experiences, abuse, and trauma. Now, if you've ever been triggered by something, you probably know exactly what it feels like, but ultimately, scientifically, it's basically where a specific situation or stimulus evokes a really intense emotional reaction from you. And the reason this happens is often because you unconsciously are unaware that this is even going on inside of you, but you're reminded by whatever it was that triggered you of the past traumatic experience that you went through. So triggers really are just sensory experiences, right? So think of sight, sound, smell, right? All the things that we are taking in from our outer environment. So all the things that happen outside of us, sensory-wise, that could potentially trigger us, right? All those external things. So they can even be interactions or maybe words or a song, right, that we hear or something like that, that acts as a reminder of whatever happened to us in the past that was traumatic, okay? So these kinds of triggers, right, are often connected to memories of negative or distressing types of things, events, and experiences that we went through. And in this case, we're talking specifically about emotional abuse and trauma, right? So I like to think of triggers like if you had a guitar that was just sitting in the corner, right? Well, that guitar is not doing anything until someone comes along and plucks a string, right? As soon as that string gets plucked, it starts to make a sound. And for me, that's how triggers often felt, was like everything was fine and nothing was happening until one day something plucked that string inside of me, and then it was like ming, like making me have anxiety or worry or fear or whatever, insert whatever emotion. So, when you're triggered, you can experience all different kinds of emotions that are still like very much linked to the original abuse of whatever it was that you went through. So if you were afraid of something, like if someone, like for instance, this is an example of something that used to happen to me, where my ex-husband, whenever he would come home and the garage door would open up, I had to rush to make sure everything was ready to go, that the dinner plate was on the table, that he had a full glass of milk, that everything was warm, and like he wanted to eat as soon as he got in the door. And he would even call me like 30 minutes ahead and be like, I'm on my way home. So I was like timing everything and making sure, everything was ready to go. So that the trigger of that fear and anxiety of like he was going to be upset if it wasn't already was associated with the sound of the garage door opening. So that was something that my brain remembered and knew like this is important, right? This sound of the garage is important to keep me feeling safe. So if I heard that sound, I knew immediately what was going to happen, what needed to be done, right? All of that. So it was associated with fear and helplessness and other kinds of emotions as well. But ultimately, that sound, which again, like I said before, like sights and sounds and smells are external stimulus, right? So that external stimulus of that sound is carried inside of my brain and inside of my body. So even though I'm no longer with my abuser anymore, afterwards, when the garage door would open, when I'm not even living at that house anymore with him, I would feel triggered. I would feel the same exact thing that I felt when I was still in the abusive relationship. So maybe you've experienced something like this where you hear a song or you hear a sound or you have a smell or you see a car or whatever, right? Those kinds of things will create triggers. Now, there's lots and lots of other ways that triggers can be presented, but this is just kind of on a simple scale that most people probably understand these kinds of triggers and can relate to them. So again, what you're doing is you're re-experiencing the same feelings that are associated with the original trauma or the original abuse, even if the current situation is not actively threatening you, right? So like if my garage door opens today and I still get triggered by it and I'm no longer with the person, right? It's still bringing up those same feelings and emotions. Now, I have processed these things and I no longer get triggered by that sound anymore. But if you haven't been processing these things and you're still getting triggered, then of course, even though you're not actively being threatened or actively under threat, you may still be experiencing the same feelings with the trigger, whatever that external stimuli might be. Now, triggers can often lead to sudden emotional responses and often overwhelming emotional responses, right? So because you feel like you're reliving it in the moment. And so some people even talk about these as like a flashback. And they're very, very similar. They're in a similar vein, except for flashbacks don't always have to be negative, right? A flashback, you could be thinking about something positive too. So, but a trigger is where you are almost like immediately snapped back in time to the original wound or trauma that you experienced. And it can create a flood of emotions to come through. And for some people, it can send them into full-on anxiety or panic attacks. Now, triggers this is important to know too, right? Because that's like the psychological aspect of it, what's happening inside of your brain and your mind and your body. But the physiological responses, right? Like actual physical responses, is that triggers can really create physical problems. Like emotional triggers can create physical problems. Like I mentioned, like a panic attack, you might be hyperventilating. Your heart rate could rise. You could get like sweaty palms. You could be extremely agitated. Whatever it is, you may have a physical response to triggers as well. And the body, right, has this amazing system, your nervous system, that starts the fight or flight response, right? So if your fight or flight response starts to activate because of a trigger, then what it's doing is preparing you to respond to whatever danger it perceives, even if that danger is not an actual real threat, like the garage door opening, right? There's no real threat today if my garage door opens. It's just a garage door opening. But if a person is in fight or flight mode, right, because of a trigger, then they're going to be perceiving that danger is real and right now in the moment. Now, we have to be careful because you can be actively under threat, actively experiencing real threats or real danger. So you have to be aware and know what is a real threat and what is just a perceived threat that's based on a trigger or a trauma. And that's really, really important, because if you're someone who actively has a stalker, right, like that is a real threat. That is not a perceived threat. If your stalker is in jail and you're still getting triggered, that is a perceived threat, because the stalker is no longer able to actually put you in danger. So we have to make sure we're really, really careful about distinguishing between what is a real threat and what is a perceived threat, because often they get muddied. The water gets cloudy, because in our mind, everything feels real. Like when you're being triggered, everything feels real. Okay. Now, what acts as a trigger for individuals can be highly personal, and it will always be specific to your own experiences and your emotional and physical associations with that trauma, right? So depending on what happened to you, you may experience it very differently, right? If two children are living in the same home and one of the parents is highly reactive, maybe they have an alcohol problem and they yell and do this or that or the other, one child's experience can be very different from the other child's experience and how they associate it, right? Like maybe if the drunken parent is let's say they're being silly to one of the children, picks them up, and the child gets a whiff of the alcohol smell, right? That alcohol smell could be highly triggering to that one child, right, throughout their life. If the other child never had that same experience, or maybe they associated it differently, maybe if that parent was throwing things or slamming doors or doing something else, that child may have triggers associated with that, right? So it's very, very, very unique to each person. So that's why it's important for you to understand where your triggers come from. What is it that you're specifically feeling in the way of whatever it is that's triggering you? Is it coming from a sound? Is it coming from a sight, like something you see visually? Is it coming from the way people speak or their body language? There's lots and lots of things that can create a trigger for you. I had a trigger one time about spending money. Like I didn't know where it was even coming from, but I had been out of my abusive relationship for a couple of years. I went to the grocery store. I spent more than I normally spent when I was with my abuser, because there was budgets and things that I had to adhere to. And if I didn't, then I would have lectures and I would get in trouble and all these things. So when I went to the store by myself and, wasn't even really paying attention because it was my money at that point, I didn't, have to report to anybody. I got to the parking lot and I was putting my groceries away and I almost had a panic attack right in the parking lot and I couldn't figure out why that was. I didn't know. And then when I was finally able to settle down through it and, I was using, my brain and I was using subconscious healing work to kind of get me settled. But what I realized afterwards was that the reason I had this response, this trigger, what triggered me was that I had spent more money than I ever had spent at the grocery store in one trip. And there were subconscious beliefs in my mind that were related to fear and being powerless and predicting the future about what was going to happen. There was a lot of things that I wasn't consciously aware of. So that's why I went into that almost spin out situation with this particular, the trigger was that I spent the money. Like I was just spending money and I was actually triggered by that because I was afraid I was going to get in trouble and that I was going to have to listen to a lecture and then I was a bad mom and I didn't care about how long it was going to take for my ex to retire because, all these crazy things that were going through my head unconsciously. I was unconsciously aware of it. Now, you may be consciously aware of where your triggers come from and what they are, but sometimes they're not that easy. Sometimes they're very, very difficult to identify. So common triggers, right? Like this all varies from person to person, but common triggers related to emotional abuse could include things like a tone of voice that someone uses with you. I know that when my ex would lower his voice, he would get softer and softer and softer. And I would get louder and louder because I was reacting to the situation, right? But when people lower their voice now to me, I'm not triggered by it anymore, but I used to be like, why are you doing that? Like it used to really bother me when people would, even my own mother, like if she would start to lower her voice, like if we were at a restaurant or something, it would really bother me. So tone of voice can be something that you can be triggered by. Phrases, words and things, right? Maybe your child says something that your ex says all the time and they come home and they say it because they hear their other parents say it, right? So it could be phrases, it could be a look, it could be certain times of the year even, or locations, right, that are associated with the abuse or something like that. So there's lots and lots of variables here that can create triggers. It's not just sensory things, but it is mostly external kinds of things. They will happen out of the blue sometimes, and many times you can't predict when they're going to happen. Now, if you know that it is highly triggering for you to hear a specific type of song, right? Like maybe it's like a song that used to be your song or something, right? Like you're not going to turn that on because it triggers you. But what if you're at the grocery store and that song comes on in the grocery store? Right? Because they play music in the grocery store or whatever, right? What if you hear that song and then you're not prepared, right? So you can avoid the triggers yourself, but sometimes you can't avoid them. So there's ways to get ahead of them so that kind of thing, if you know that that is a trigger for you, will not affect you. And that's what I was saying earlier, where like, yes, some of them you have to manage, some of them you can completely remove, and some of them you just lessen. All right, so recognizing your triggers is often the first step, right, in managing them. So knowing what they are, like I was just mentioning, but, understanding the specific things that could create a traumatic memory for you is going to be really, really helpful. And you can, like I said, you can cope with some of these things, but some of them you can actually get ahead of. Like I'll give you a specific example of mine. So when I was out of my abusive relationship, my ex and I were still texting at that point. We hadn't been using the Our Family Wizard app, but when we were texting, every single time I would get a text from him, I would get this stomach drop. Immediate stomach drop. Like I just felt sick to my stomach. I didn't even know what was going to be in the message. I had no idea. It could have been, have a nice day. I mean, probably wouldn't have been that, but it could have been anything, right? And I had no idea what it was going to be, but I still got that awful, horrible stomach drop, and I hated it. I hated it so much because I felt like I shouldn't have to have a physical sick to my stomach feeling every time a text message comes across my phone. And I had been working on, managing my triggers, and I had been practicing subconscious healing and reprogramming my brain, and I had it. And I was like, I'm done with this. I got to fix this. I cannot stand this anymore. So I worked for about 3 to 4 weeks reprogramming my brain on this one thing, on this one particular thing, because it was bothering me so bad. And I really just felt like he had control. I felt like he still had control over me. If he was able to just send a text message and it would cause me to have a stomach drop or like the sick feeling, like it's almost like he had a voodoo doll or something of me. He could just like send a text message and cause me to be sick to my stomach. Like, what the heck is that? I hated that. I did not want that to be my life. So what I did from there, practicing this, was really try to understand what was creating the fear. What was creating that physical response in me was what I was believing about those messages, and also what I was believing about him and what I was believing about myself. So once I figured those things out, then I was able to start reprogramming those things and choose what to believe, right? So the choice to believe something different from what I had always been believing was actually what changed. So like I said, 3 to 4 weeks later, because of reprogramming these things and actively putting it into practice, one day I got another text message out of the blue, and I just happened to be on my phone at that time, like scrolling my social media or something, and the text message came through, like the notification at the top of my phone, and I remember I just swiped it away, and then I was like, oh my gosh, like I didn't feel any, like it didn't get the stomach drop that time. It was so exciting because what I had been doing worked, right? What I had been doing to reprogram my mind actually changed so I wasn't triggered. And so that's why I want you to know and understand, like certain things, absolutely, you can remove the trigger, right? Some people think, oh, it's just going to always be that way. Some things you might not even know are going to trigger you, right? Because maybe they've been buried for so long, you haven't even thought about it in years, and then something happens and you have this trigger. Now, the good news about this is when you have this tool and you are triggered by something like that you cannot get ahead of or you aren't anticipating, you now have the tools to sit down and reprogram it in that moment so that you can get out of that emotion faster, right? So that you're not like spinning out, having a huge emotional reaction to it, losing focus, not able to be present in whatever you're doing, right? You can actually shorten the time that you experience the negative feeling from whatever it is that triggered you that you weren't prepared for. So that's really important too, to understand that, often people think, okay, fine, well, I can't get ahead of that trigger. What happens when I get triggered? Well, you can lessen it. You can make it a 10-minute situation instead of a 3-day situation that you're feeling horrible about it. That's what the power of reprogramming does for your mind. So, and your emotions, obviously, because they're connected. So that was my story. And that is a very, very, very specific example of one thing that I have done to reprogram my mind. But I have reprogrammed so many other things as well to bring me back to peace, because that's my priority. Now, this has such a positive impact on my mental health and well-being, because when you're being triggered by something, what is the first thing that happens? You have an immediate cloud of emotion that takes over, right? The emotion makes it hard for you to think clearly, to speak clearly, to act logically, right? And so when that emotion is in the way, it's really just kind of jamming up all the things that are really needed for you to respond and behave the way that you feel like would make you the best version of yourself. So if you are being led by triggers and led by these negative emotions, you're basically being clouded by all of that stuff, which is keeping you from clarity, which is keeping you from being able to focus, which is keeping you from being able to be present or enjoy your life or just be at peace, right? So it will definitely impact you if you don't get a hold of these things. And I fully understand this. And if you're, somebody who's experiencing triggers, you get this too, because you know that as soon as that happens, it's really, really hard to think of anything except for how you're feeling in that moment and the emotions that you're experiencing. And it's important to feel your emotions. Like, I'm not saying that emotions are bad. They're not. It's important to recognize and feel, what is this emotion? Why am I feeling it? And let it pass through. We're not trying to ignore the emotions or stuff them or shove them under the rug. We are essentially feeling them, acknowledging them, and then figuring out where they came from, which is from your subconscious, and then remove that as it's passing through so that you can feel the way that you want to be feeling, right? Most people don't want to be feeling triggered. Most people don't want to feel anxiety and fear and worry and all these things. But you can feel it, right, when it happens, and know that it's not bad, and know that it's not, the end of the world. Let's feel it, and then let's figure out where it's coming from, and then remove it. Okay? Now, just as a quick reminder again about my Radiate and Rise community, I just want to tell you what you can expect in here, so that if you do want to join and you're interested, how you can do that and why it's important for you to be here. So the safety was really, really important to me. Having an incognito space for people to join, and even when you come on the monthly coaching calls, you can keep your camera off and you don't even have to speak up. You can just listen to me coach others, or if nobody wants to speak up, I'll just have stuff to talk about. As you know, I can sit here and I've been talking for 27 minutes straight right now. You can change your name. You don't have to use your real name if you don't want to. You don't have to put your picture out there. And then also, it's a subscription model, basically. So you're getting a really great value because you get to pay as you go, basically. I mean, it's always going to come out unless you cancel, but you can cancel anytime. So $33 a month, you come in if you find that it's helping you and you are enjoying getting to know people and getting coached by me twice a month for $33, then you can stay. And if you're like, you know what, this isn't for me, that's fine. It's totally risk-free and you can leave anytime you want. All right, so one thing I wanted to talk about really quickly is challenges of managing your triggers alone, okay? And as we go through our emotional abuse recovery and we're trying to heal, right? Especially for those of us who have faced a lot of trauma, managing our triggers can feel like you are in a maze all by yourself. And this can be very complicated. It can be confusing, and it can really feel overwhelming, especially. And what I would love for you to do is imagine that you're on a boat, and up ahead there's a storm, there are turbulent waters, right? And every single wave, right, every single time the boat moves, you start feeling more and more scared. It feels threatening, and maybe the boat's going to flip over at any time. Like, you do not feel stable at all, right? And this is exactly what it can feel like when you are trying to handle your emotional triggers without someone else to lean on. And you may even know like the basics of boating and, steering a ship or rowing if you're in a rowboat, but the unpredictability of nature, right? or the ocean that you're in makes it really, really, really daunting to think about doing this and managing it by yourself. And here's the thing, right? Many of us try to do these things alone. I did. I will admit it. I tried to do these things by myself in the beginning. And we think that if we just read the right book or watch the right motivational video, that we're going to be equipped to face these kind of waves by ourselves. Now, while those resources, I am not in any way invalidating them, are valuable, right? They are valuable. Sometimes what we really need is a navigator or someone who can guide us through the storm. And because our triggers are so personal, right? They're so deeply, deeply personal, like I said before, and unique. They're tied to our specific stories, right? They're our deepest fears and our unhealed wounds. So handling them, right, isn't just about knowing what triggers you, but it's also understanding why and how, more importantly, that our responses can be reshaped. So this process of healing and managing your triggers is very intricate. But without a map or without expert guidance, we can find ourselves going in circles, repeating the same behaviors, doing the same things, and still experiencing the same triggers as always. So this is where I feel really strongly about support from professionals, therapists, a community, a mentor, a coach. These kinds of things become really, really valuable, right? Because these people have often been where you are. So it's like having a captain of the ship have gone through, this is his 30th storm like this that the captain has been through and has been able to get out of it, right? You'd feel a lot safer and more comfortable with somebody guiding the ship that's been through it. Now, when you have support like this, you're not in the boat alone anymore. You have someone guiding it, or you have someone helping you, right? You have somebody who knows the waters and that can steer you away from the roughest waves and towards the calmer part of the sea. So, this would be somebody who can provide you not just the map, but the strategy that's tailored for you to help you and ensure that wherever you go and whatever you're doing is taking you toward stability and away from all of that negativity and the turmoil and the triggers and all of that. So if you've been trying to manage your triggers by yourself and you think you can just talk yourself out of it, and you're finding that this is tougher than you thought, please know that there is strength in seeking support, and it doesn't make you weak. It makes you wise. And I'm here to offer that kind of support to you as well, right? I offer free 20-minute one-on-one chats where we can talk about your specific challenges. I offer the Radiate and Rise community, which is $33 a month, where you're going to get a ton of support and one-on-one coaching in group coaching with me. But, if you're the only one on the call that day, I guess it would be one-on-one, where you're not only going to get guidance, right, from me and other people, but you're going to get tools and you're going to get encouragement and you're going to get understanding and validation from people who have been on this journey too. So I think it's really important to explore why completely avoiding triggers isn't always feasible. And more importantly than that is how we can equip ourselves to face these things head on without fear. Okay? Now, triggers cannot always be avoided, as I said before. And in everyday life, there's probably going to be times that you are triggered with whether you are working on your mindset, doing therapy, like all these things. Like sometimes it's just going to be inevitable. But what you can do is lean on your abilities and your resilience and your strategies to be able to adapt to the unknown, right? For when you cannot avoid it. So knowing and just thinking about the fact that you have been able to deal with challenges, that you have been able to get through really, really unexpected and unavoidable things before in your life, is kind of leaning on those things will help you, that even if you do get triggered in those moments, that you can remind yourself that, wait a second, I've never experienced this before. I am being triggered and I've never dealt with this, but I have been able to calm myself down in the face of an emergency, or I have been able to handle something very unexpected with absolute grace and resilience, or whatever, right? So like just kind of leaning on examples of times that you were able to adapt to difficulties and challenges that may have arisen without you ever planning for it. So the goal really is not to create a trigger-free life, right? Because that's not realistic, but it is to help you build a better toolkit for your emotions. And that is one of the tools. The main tool that I use is rapid reprogramming. And that really can help you navigate unpredictability with more confidence, so that when those things do happen, you're prepared. And if you're not prepared, right, because obviously we can't be prepared for everything, but if you're not prepared, that you can manage that trigger much easier in the immediate aftermath, to turn it from something that would maybe last several hours to something that only lasts maybe several minutes. And wouldn't that be nice, right? Okay. I really hope that this episode is speaking to you, especially if you have been feeling like triggers are taking up a lot of bandwidth for you and derailing you, or keeping you from being able to focus, or causing you to spin out emotionally. Understanding your triggers is really important. And I kind of mean like understanding them is maybe like too distant of a word. Maybe it needs to be like more of being intimate with your triggers, because the better relationship that you have in being intimate and understanding your triggers, the easier it's going to be for you to tame them, right? And making sure that you're not shaming yourself, or you're not, I remember being in a panic attack one time and beating myself up, like, you're so weak and you can't even hold it together, and what is wrong with you, and there's something wrong. Like, that is wrong. Like, there's nothing wrong with you if you get triggered. There is nothing wrong with you. I'm telling you firsthand. Like, it is actually just an emotional response from whatever outside thing happened. That is your nervous system kicking into high gear, right? We just aren't used to experiencing these kinds of things in the ways that our ancestors did, right? Like, they were fighting for survival. So if they had to fight, the fight or flight response kick in, it was because they were being chased by a predator, or something horrible was going to happen to them and their life was in danger, right? Our lives, when we're being triggered by things, right? And again, remember, if this is a real threat or an imagined threat, or perceived threat, if you aren't actively being threatened, but you're still getting triggered, your body's still reacting the same way as if you are being chased by a saber-toothed tiger or whatever. Okay, so understanding these triggers is so important, because you have to know that what you're experiencing is unique to you. And there's definitely ways that you can manage these and lessen them, but you have to be familiar and you have to know you can't just let them pass by and be fleeting. You have to understand what's happening inside of you. I shared a couple of my personal stories. I'd love to hear from you. If there's things that are triggering you, you can send a message through the chat, but make sure you include your name, at least a first name, because it doesn't tell me. It says, like, in the show notes, it'll say send a text message, but if you don't tell me who you are, I won't be able to give a shout out to you, but I would love to be able to do that. Or you can message me or email me if you want to tell me about it. And I'm happy to listen and to converse with you about that. And we probably have a lot of similar ones, is my guess. All right. And again, right, like managing these alone is going to be a lot harder. I tried managing mine alone. It was so much harder than when I had support, people who understood, and having tools that actually work. So just remember, your triggers can't always be avoided, but you can prepare yourself in ways that you are feeling more confident to deal with them when they happen. And then if you have the right tools, to be able to shift out of that in much, much less time. Please reach out to me if you need support. Again, I'm inviting everyone to book a free 20-minute chat with me. Talk about anything that you want, just get to know me. If you just want me to talk to you, I can do that too. So I love getting to know people, and it helps me when you schedule these calls with me, because not only am I able to guide you and support you, but I'm actually able to use some of the things that you talk about, and I have done this many times, in future podcast episodes to help other people, or in my next book, or in a post or a reel that I'm going to create, right? So hearing from you actually helps me too. So yeah, it's free, but I'm still getting something from it. I'm getting something, you're getting something. It's a win-win. So you can schedule a free 20-minute chat to talk about whatever you want, and I will help you and support you during that 20 minutes for whatever you need. The other thing is, don't forget, you can join Radiate and Rise for ongoing support and resources, 2 monthly coaching calls, weekly content, support, validation, and incognito space. So check everything out in the link in the show notes. And if there's other things that you want me to talk about on this podcast that would help you, please send me a message at Allison@radiaten, the letter N, rise.com. Thanks so much for listening. I am so grateful to have you as listeners in my community, and I will talk to you next week.